Am I worried? Of course, that's always a worry. Anybody that is worth a grain of salt in the drug development business or biologics, which is what this is in vaccines, that's honest with themselves and honest with the public has to say there's always hidden risk. So I'm a physician and a scientist. I was practicing in clinical research for many years, ran a consulting company, and then got a phone call from a CIA officer who was in Wuhan on January 2nd of 2020. And ever since then, my life has just been kind of a roller coaster of drug repurposing and trying to find ways to treat COVID, and then getting caught up in all of the issues around the jab and whether or not it's safe and effective. And then from that, having been hit with just a ton of propaganda and press attacks and everything, increasingly I've become somebody that speaks out about what's been going on with the media and the press and the psyops that have been really performed on all of us. And in the meantime, what my wife and I got a book out, and we publish a Substack now, that Substack essay daily, that hits about the same audience as CNN primetime. So that's a yay. and So I think that's a good brief introduction. And when I was a young man, I had the original invention disclosures and patents for the mRNA technology platform that gave rise to the current vaccines.
You've been kind of widely ridiculed by the public, by the media. I think anyone who watches you would know that you're not this crazy conspiracy theorist. You're a doctor. You're very intelligent. I'm just curious, what are you saying that's so controversial to these people?
Well, I've been guilty of speaking truth to power, basically, is my sin. And I've it turns out that because I've been focused on the data all the way through, I've called a lot of things correctly far earlier than they became the accepted narrative, and that apparently is a sin, an unforgivable one in the eyes of the press. I think that I the reaction that they've had to me is so over the top, from corporate media uh, and tech, that it seems to suggest that they see me as a threat. And I think the threat that I pose is that people listen to me. They find what I say useful. I speak truth. I'm quite careful to stay aligned with the actual scientific data, and I've had this now, very clear record over the last few years of being way out in front of things, calling it as I see it, and getting it right. And notably, there was the Joe Rogan podcast that a little over a year ago that uh, Google lost their cookies over because I said mass formation psychosis, and and the press attacked in so many ways because I was saying things like talking about the perverse incentives for over-diagnosing COVID and what was going on in the hospitals and what was going on in medical care across the United States and across the world, talking about the propaganda campaigns that were going on, and that I think is the basis for all of these attacks. That many of them uh, start off with some statement that is gaslighting or you know negative about whether or not I accurately represent my role in this technology. And virtually none of them cite the 9 issued patents that were all filed about 1990 to 1991. Uh, but And then they attacked me because I was a supporter of ivermectin and other drugs and early treatments. But this is a pattern that all of the physicians that have spoken out have experienced. It's to the point now where if somebody asserts that they've been speaking truth during the COVID crisis, and you look up their wiki page and it isn't aggressively edited to make them sound like a flame throwing radical, then something's wrong, because it's been done to all of us, and often by the same sock puppet, Philip Cross, which is apparently a sock puppet for MI5 in the UK. We have all been subjected to some pretty serious military grade psyops over the last 3 years, and this includes in the UK. I was just there 2 weekends ago, I guess. No, last weekend. If we can, today's Sunday. We're broadcasting, and there they have a group called the 77th Brigade that's actually military. There's a member of the parliament that belongs to it. And since I was there speaking out against the jab and in support of Andrew Bridgen, who is this member of parliament that was kicked out of the Conservative Party for speaking truth about COVID, the 77th Brigade has been starting to cause me grief on Twitter, etc. But that's just the way they roll. Uh, this is. I'll say it again. This is 3 years of military grade psyops that we've had perpetrated on civilian populations by their own governments.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty funny that you mention, these patents go all the way back to 1990, 1991. Nobody knows this mRNA technology better than you do. And so it's really interesting when the vaccine first came out. Um, it felt like the people who were in support of the vaccine were on the side of science, and the people who weren't are the crazy nut jobs, religious people, whatever it might be. And now it almost feels like, especially with your voice becoming louder and louder in this area, it feels more like people who are against the vaccine are more on the side of science, and the people who are for the vaccine are just unabashedly vaccine can do no wrong. Get more jabs. Like,
Yeah, propagandists, that many of which. So we've learned a lot of things over the last couple of years. In I try to capture a lot of those in this book that we put out, "The Lies My Government Told Me and the Better Future Coming," uh, and tried to write that in a way so that people who haven't experienced this on the front lines, they haven't been one of the physicians or one of the people getting censored, can read it and get a sense of what it's really been like to be on the front lines, and then also to walk with me in trying to understand what has really happened behind all of this, what's gone on in the government, what's gone on in the World Health Organization, what's gone on at the World Economic Foundation, of all of these integrated things that have been happening, that have the economics that have uh, been manipulated to cause this massive upward transfer of wealth and destruction of the middle class, etc. Uh, we've it's been an amazing time. It's truly a historic time, uh, and um, this this propaganda that has been perpetrated is fascinating in a sense. I mean, it's twisted and sick and evil, but it's also fascinating the power that governments and big pharma have, and whoever this shadowy organization or group or whatever that's behind all this, that no one really knows who it is. uh, that's another thing that's um, remains troubling. But clearly, a massive amount of capital and planning were dumped right at the start of this, to promote this narrative of fear, and to weaponize fear and cause governments and populations to behave in various ways. Uh, I really think that whoever or whatever was behind this really drove the politicians through fear to do things that were super counterproductive. And I'm sorry to say, I think that Mr. Trump was among those, and those in his inner circle that clearly overreacted, and but not as badly as Mr. Biden has with his mandates and what he's done with the military.
Absolutely so. And you just mentioned Trump as well, just the vaccine being pushed out near the end of his presidency. And one of the biggest things in his last year being to push the vaccine out and get the vaccine ready for people, ASAP. I think pretty much most people can agree that it was pushed out very quickly. Some others may say too quickly.
I would say too quickly. I think that's a fair statement. I think you can defend that based on the data. You don't have to apologize for it.
Well, yes. So the vaccine was pushed out way too quick. I think, like you said, everybody just got into a panic over this stuff. So I was wondering if, do you think, given more time, mRNA would be the solution to, a COVID vaccination, or should it maybe have been like another formula altogether, or should we have even had a vaccination or a jab? Period.
So, uh, for the for this virus, for coronaviruses in general, there's never been a successful human vaccine, and I think it's getting to the point where we can conclude that these were not successful vaccines. There are two licensed veterinary vaccines for coronaviruses. They're both intranasal. Uh, One is for feline infectious peritonitis, and the other is for a cattle coronavirus. And but otherwise, the history of trying to build a coronavirus vaccine for humans has been super frustrating. Uh, in a recent article, Tony Fauci, as together with the head of viral evolution and pathogenesis at NIH, published a paper in one of the cell-based journals in which they acknowledge that this technology, this approach for coronavirus wasn't working and couldn't work because these respiratory viruses evolve so quickly, and these respiratory RNA viruses infect the upper airway and the nasopharynx, which are mucosal tissues. And this kind of a vaccination where you're getting an injection into your deltoid, that causes a different profile of immune response. It circulates in your body, but it doesn't necessarily go to your mucosal tissues. And so it's just generally not particularly effective. And a good case can be made that the massive vaccine campaign has actually driven viral evolution to escape whatever immune response was being generated. So, could this technology have been useful in developing an effective coronavirus vaccine? That's always a possibility, but it wasn't. When I was approached about this in January 2020, I did a threat assessment. My determination was that the only real short-term hope was repurposed drugs, and so that's what I focused on. And including with Department of Defense money, I got a team spun up, and we did quite a bit of work with drug repurposing, including ivermectin. But I thought that developing a safe and effective coronavirus vaccine was just not going to happen. It was a fool's errand and shouldn't be done. Obviously, Tony Fauci disagreed at the time, as did Deborah Birx. But now, in retrospect, they say things like, "Well, we know we really didn't have the science, but we hoped that things would work." We have the Pfizer vice president testifying to the European Union Parliament that they had no data suggesting that it was going to be effective in stopping infection, replication, and spread when they basically scared and coerced the European Union and most nation states all across the world to buy this product. Um, could RNA vaccine technology be made useful? I I had thought that the best use for it would be for rapid production of vaccine products largely for special ops forces and small local outbreaks, where you had a highly pathogenic virus or a high risk of engineered pathogen. And the typical scenario is the SOCOM, the Special Ops Command, has to insert a strike force into a high threat environment where there's intelligence that there's some new bad infectious disease or bioweapon being developed or deployed or manufactured, and they need some sort of short-term cover. The tech that the DoD likes best for this is monoclonal antibodies, because they can be injected into the warfighter. He can go in theater, he or she, and go in theater, do their business, come back out. The antibodies degrade in a couple of months, and then they're shipped back to their family, and there's no residual in theory. Uh, that hasn't worked out so well, and we've seen the monoclonal antibodies really haven't performed at the level we had hoped, and they're expensive and kludgy to make. So the DoD and the government in general, and in particular, it's important to note, it really was DARPA, and this, which is to say the CIA, that has driven this technology. They're the ones that have capitalized. They basically built Moderna and funded it. And it's the CIA's uh, venture capital arm, InQtel, that's building the new RNA vaccine manufacturing facility in Canada. So the intelligence community is all over this, and they want to have this kind of rapid response capability. They think that's what's necessary. What happened, though, since what I did when I had my inventions is about a decade later, this group from Penn came along, UPenn, Creco and Weissman, and they tried to address one of the core problems of the tech, which is that it's really inflammatory. And the RNA doesn't stick around very long if it's natural RNA, which was, I believed, was one of the advantages. You don't necessarily want a molecule like this staying in your body for a long period of time. You want it to be naturally degraded, because if something goes wrong, if you have an adverse event or a toxicity, um, you want to be able to have that wash out of the person's body, and then you can choose not to redose it if they're having a problem. But Creco and Weissman inserted pseudouridine, which is a natural molecule, but in RNA, it's only present in very precise places, and the biology of it is still not really understood. But what they did was they knew that some pseudouridine could make RNA more stable and less inflammatory. So they put pseudouridine all the way through the whole RNA. There's nothing like that in nature. So these things that everybody's been taking are really not natural RNA. There's something else. They're a pseudo RNA. And they have different properties. They stick around in the body for a very long period of time, at least 60 days. They can be found circulating in the blood for weeks. Uh, and and they seem to have some immunosuppressive capabilities. But it's not just the particles, the lipid nanoparticles, that deliver the RNA, and it's not just the RNA, but it's also the spike protein. And that was a really bad choice. I mean, it may be the more immunogenic protein in the virus, but it is a major toxin. And that was another thing I got criticized for saying early on, beginning on the Brett Weinstein podcast, which was many months before the Joe Rogan one. And they attacked me for saying spike is a toxin, but I think now very few people would disagree that spike is a toxin. And you just had to pay attention to the data and not the propaganda, and you would know that. But we can see that now because, for instance, the Novavax product has just had more warnings placed on it, which has spike protein that's produced in insect cells and then purified and then formulated into the vaccine and injected into you. And that also causes myocarditis and blood clotting. So it's not just the formulations, it's the spike. And then is it the formulations? There's that question. Well, we just got a good answer from that. Moderna did phase 3 trials on their influenza vaccine using the same tech. And they basically had to abandon that flu vaccine product because it's too toxic. It has the same kinds of toxicity that the coronavirus vaccines have. So, um, could the tech have been useful? Uh, there's a company in Germany called CureVac that was pursuing something more like what I had originally intended. It didn't have the pseudouridine in it, uh, but they dosed it at a lower level because they were more careful, being more careful in doing the dose escalation studies, and so it didn't have as much immunogenicity as the ones with pseudouridine, but dose for dose, it was pretty similar. We don't really know how toxic that would have been. So, because it wasn't really deployed widely, so we can't see the things like the myocarditis that only happen in, one in a few thousand young boys, for instance. Uh, Although the overall serious adverse event rate for these mRNA-based COVID vaccines seems to be something in the range of 1 in 500 or 1 in 600. That's really high for serious adverse events, the kind of things that put you in the hospital. So could it have ever worked? I don't know, but at this point, uh, it has been so contaminated. They tried to roll out some RNA vaccines in Africa, and I'm sure they will again with this Marburg outbreak. But the Africans were like, forget about it. I don't want that stuff. That's nasty stuff. And I think that's unfortunately going to be the trajectory here. Over the next year, we're going to learn more and more, despite all their efforts to propagandize. And so, I hope I've answered your question.
So do you worry about there being any kind of like long-term side effects that we're not seeing any evidence of now that we'll see, 10, 20 years from now?
So that's am I worried? Of course, that's always a worry. Anybody that is worth a grain of salt in the drug development business or biologics, which is what this is in vaccines, that's honest with themselves and honest with the public has to say, there's always hidden risks. No drug and no vaccine is perfectly safe. That's just the way things are. The question is, how safe is it relative to the thing that it's trying to prevent or treat? And my wife likes to say, if COVID was Ebola and it was a respiratory transmitted Ebola, which, by the way, when the West African Ebola outbreak happened, I was very involved in that, in the bringing forth what we now call the Merck Ebola vaccine. That's part of my history. And there was a point where I was traveling to the client in Ames, Iowa, that had the product that I was trying to help the client with, when I got a call from a friend, a colonel, who just come out of a Pentagon briefing, and he was scared silly because they had been discussing a scenario involving respiratory transmitted Ebola. And the scenario indicated that there'd be about 1 billion people dead in the world. If we had had something like that that was really nasty, and I can tell you, Ebola scares people. They go, it drives them crazy. People will do things, they'll shoot each other. They will force people into compounds. The stuff that went on in West Africa during that initial outbreak was sick. People just go crazy. It is an ugly death, an ugly disease. And if we had had something like that circulating in the United States, people would have been lining up for a half-baked, crummy vaccine that causes toxicity. They would have been glad to take it, right? The Ebola vaccine that Merck has is actually a nasty piece of work. It really, you feel awful after you take it. Your joints hurt. It is a nasty vaccine. But Ebola is a nasty, nasty disease. And people, when there's an Ebola outbreak, they're kind of glad to line up for that. And if we'd had something like that, that would have been a different case. And what it's illustrating with that little story is that it's all about the risk benefit. And unfortunately, whether it was the CCP propaganda or it was Pfizer or whoever spreading all that fear porn that got amplified by corporate media. Um, many people, and early on, I also believed that we were dealing with a real major toxin, a major potential pathogen that was going to have significant damage to the population. We quickly learned that was not the case. And now even Bill Gates is acknowledging that we overreacted and this was not such a lethal pathogen. And really, the World Health Organization blew it in how they responded to this thing. But if it had been a nasty piece of work, like a aerosol transmitted Ebola kind of a thing, it would have been a different story. But it's not. And um, now we have the government having acted as if it was. They basically deployed the full force of all of their planning and all of their capabilities on the general population, uh, and it was not justified. And they just ran roughshod over our rights, and now they don't even want to back off. They want to keep going on this, and the big question that leaves a lot of us with is: was this ever really about the virus, or was it about something else? When you see these numbers, like how much wealth has been transferred upwards, biggest upward transfer of wealth in the history of in modern history, in recorded history, happened over this. A lot of people jumped on this and took advantage of it. There's no question about that. And there's no question there was pre-planning. Event 201 is, in the can. We can all look at those records. Uh, and we can look at what they did in Europe, but in particular, the Five Eyes nations. Five Eyes Alliance being this intelligence cooperative that ties together Great Britain, the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. And we've all seen what has happened, particularly to Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. I mean, who would have thought it? We all thought Aussies were a bunch of crocodile Dundies with big knives that went out and killed crocs, right? They got whacked fast. A lot of people make the comment, well, there's the argument for the Second Amendment right there, and what happened with Australia. Canada and New Zealand are functionally client states now of the World Economic Forum without firing a shot. It's amazing watching it.
No, definitely. And I think a lot more people know the name Pfizer now, just going back to one of your points there as well. Dr. Malone, I've got one more question for you. First off, I just want to say thank you for coming on and answering our questions. We really do appreciate it. My last question being that we've gotten past the initial stage of where everyone reacted to this disease and what those decisions were based on those reactions. What do you think, where do you think our missteps were, and what can we learn if we ever come across another outbreak like this again?
So that's the purpose of the book, is to kind of cover that. So that's, 400 some pages with tons of references, and it was twice as long. They edited it down because they thought it'd just be used for a book stop. It's been a cascade of incompetence and bad decision making from the outset. And it's hard to say at what point did this really begin, these problems. Obviously, overestimating the nature of the virus, directly accepting the propaganda coming from the CCP that was clearly weaponized and pushed into the U.S. government through a variety of channels. Then the decision to really short circuit all of the normal processes to ensure that we have safe and effective products in the development of the vaccines, but also development of many of the drugs. Uh, remdesivir, the United States is pretty much the only place that uses it. It's too toxic. But it was pumped and hyped by Tony Fauci. The assembly of the original COVID strike force under Deborah Birx, that was really mismanaged. Poor choices, unfortunately. Uh, the suppression of early treatment clearly was a major screw up and cost probably millions of lives, certainly hundreds of thousands of lives. The overuse of ventilators early on, in particular, has cost lives. The practice of following this rigid protocol, where if you come to the hospital and you're sick with COVID, they would send you away with at most aspirin or some over the counter anti-inflammatory, and tell you to come back when your lips are blue, when you really have significant lung compromise. That's pretty sick. It's really damaged the reputation of the entire healthcare infrastructure and physicians in general. Uh, so then we move through the failure to support early treatment, the um, gaslighting of ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, the failure to pursue those.
That was one I was going to mention too, was the ivermectin thing, because it really did feel like they were just against that from the outset.
Yeah, they were. And ivermectin is an amazing drug. Uh, it has antiviral activity and a bunch of other activities. It seems to act, in this case, in multiple pathways. Uh, Obviously, bypassing any norms in bioethics, not providing informed consent, uh, deploying this propaganda campaign that resulted in coercion and all the way down to the children. The masking was totally arbitrary and capricious. There's a recent Cochrane meta-analysis review that's just an extension of an ongoing meta-analysis that they've been doing for years about masks. It's very, very clear that masks don't work, especially these paper masks, let alone the cloth masks. Uh, and one of the reasons is because the transmission of coronavirus also includes your eyes. So, generally speaking, at least in my experience, a mask doesn't cover your eyes. Uh, and so it doesn't block that route of transmission. It's just goofiness. The 6 foot separation was basically a couple of folks got together and said, well, what should we say for social distancing? And they pulled 6 feet out of a hat. There's no data about it.
It really felt
And
arbitrary to me when they brought that one
it
out
was
too.
arbitrary. It was totally arbitrary and capricious and counterproductive. The masking of children, the shutdown of the schools, the 14 days to flatten the curve, shut down the economy, that just destroyed small businesses, destroyed people's work, resulted in massive depression, suicide, all kinds of things. And then, as if that's not bad enough, we have Mr. Biden come in and impose his mandates. And in all this dark propaganda, I'm sure you remember about how the unjabbed are going to have this dark winter and they're all going to die. And all of the propaganda and messaging that tore the society apart and turned brothers against sisters and fathers against mothers and fathers against children. And people, they paid every influencer they could find, an artist and comedian, all over the world, all over the Western world, all at the same time, to push these propaganda messages of get the jab, uh, that weren't justified. One of the things that we talk about in the book that most people don't know about, was there was actually a study, a clinical trial of 600 people performed at Yale University before they ever had the vaccine, in which they tested out in a randomized clinical trial, 6-month follow-up, 10 different core messages to see which ones were going to be most effective at getting people to accept the jab and to try to convince other people in their lives to take the jab. And that became the source of the propaganda that they deployed against all of us. They tested out that propaganda messaging in a randomized clinical trial that in many ways is more rigorous than the clinical trials they did to test the bloody vaccines. I mean, the whole thing has just been a colossal, it's like a joke from the start. It's a sick joke. Um, you know, people talk about crimes against humanity. The death toll from this is is profound, and the government keeps lying. They lie and lie and lie, and they don't just lie. We now know from the Twitter files, they've been aggressively trying to stop anybody from speaking otherwise other than their lies. They've actually set up new language around it. They've redefined an anti vaxxer as anybody who doesn't want mandates, vaccine mandates. That's now the new definition of an anti vaxxer. They created this language of mis, dis, and malinformation. And then the Department of Homeland Security defined that as domestic terrorism. I mean, the list of, there really are crimes that have been performed here. And the you know, and now we see in the Twitter files, one of the most troubling things of all, we have collusion of government employees from low level government service workers and FBI agents all the way up to the president who have colluded. They're all sworn to uphold and protect the Constitution. They've colluded with big tech and with pharma to suppress the First Amendment, to circumvent the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And there is no remedy that any of us can take, because the only remedy, because the courts aren't holding the government accountable, the only remedy that we could possibly take is impeachment. And we've got such a hot mess in the Senate that there's no way that we could impeach. I don't think we could impeach Mayorkas successfully, the head of Homeland Security, who absolutely deserves it. You know, I think the good news of all this is that we can now see how deep the trouble is we're in. We can now see that we're in a war. It's a war for truth. It's a war about religion. It really is. It's a war about ethics. It's a war about whether or not we retain an independent nation state called the United States, because a lot of these people that are in the executive branch now, they don't seem to even believe in the utility of a nation state. They seem to all be in on this World Economic Forum, one world centralized government that's not elected, just like the European Parliament. The European Union leadership is not elected, by the way. It's a bad situation, and a lot of it seems to be that they have taken in the model of the CCP, the China solution, they call it, and they're aping that, and they seem to think that that's the way forward for the United States and its allies and the rest of the world. We're becoming our opponent, and without, we're just rolling over. And the good news is that over the last 3 years, we've all been able to see it finally. Anybody that wants to pay attention, that pays any mind to what's going on, has got to see this. And when they do, it's shocking. But that's where we're at right now, and it's a question of whether or not people are able and willing to get pissed off and do something about it, or are they just going to roll over and let their children become indentured servants? Because that's where this is heading, with this transhumanism, fusion of man and machine, fourth industrial revolution, all built around the idea that if we only had enough data on every single person and with their digital IDs and everything else, then we could apply computer algorithms, artificial intelligence, deep learning, machine learning, and optimize a centralized command economy so that the greatest good for the greatest number would be served, you'll own nothing and be happy. And you'll live in a Marxist paradise. That the reason why Marxism has never worked in the past is because we didn't have good enough tech and enough data. I mean, that seems to be the logic